Hey, John Gilroy here. In the last couple of years, I started using the term exabyte. I can't even count the number of zeros in an exabyte. Today, let's look how the federal government can efficiently manage those enormous data sets. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Our guest today is Dr. Ellison Anne Williams, CEO and founder of a company called Enveil, E-N-V-E-I-L. I guess the phrase that pays is operational efficiency with these huge data sets, huh, Ellison?
Absolutely, John. We're seeing it all over the place now.
Now, I could talk about the public cloud, the private cloud. There's these alt clouds now. There's sovereign clouds. I mean, from a management perspective from the federal government, there's all kinds of things. And these are just start of the challenges, aren't they?
For sure. Absolutely. And it all stems around data. So data is an incredible asset for any type of organization. Even more so from a federal government perspective. But then, of course, the challenge is, well, how do you unlock value from those enormous data assets amidst all of the kind of boundaries and silos in which that data is contained? And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you do that efficiently?
Right, and that's really the question. I can talk about an exabyte here, a petabyte there, or whatever big fancy word you want to use. But if you don't have access to it, you can't derive any information or value, or I guess from the federal government, make decisions. That's what they're doing. And the DOD, they're making decisions about high-level things right now. So, mention the DOD, the next word is security. And so we got to talk about security. This goes hand in hand with the discussion, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So a lot of times with this kind of rise of data, as we talked about, what we see happening is also kind of a rise of the data silos. So those silos look very different depending on the different organizations, whether that's the DOD or the IC or DHS, the federal civilian space. But most often what we see are those boundaries or silos around data are in the form of classification boundaries, for example, need to know boundaries, or if you look all the way out to third-party data providers, commercially available, publicly available information. And so if the data is in all of these kind of disparate places and all of these disparate silos, then, as we talked about before, the challenge is, well, how do you get value out of those data assets? Because that value and those insights should equate to actually decision kinds of capabilities and things like that. And so that is the specific challenge that a family of technologies called privacy enhancing technologies uniquely addresses, in that they enable data to be used to get those insights out in a secure and private way, where it is and as it is across all of these boundaries and silos. So that has the net effect of having the potential to completely change the entire paradigm around how and where any type of organization can securely and privately use data to unlock value for whatever their mission purpose is, but also to enable unprecedented operational efficiencies.
And operational efficiencies probably go hand in hand with artificial intelligence. And I got to read a quote from a guy. I just heard this quote last week, OMB CIO. And he said, they asked him, well, how fast are you moving with AI? He says, well, we want to go fast enough that we're not getting a speeding ticket, but not so slow that we get a parking ticket. So it's a balance here of how much and how little to use and when to apply it. It's almost a management issue more than a technical issue, isn't it?
Yeah. So when we talk about using data to extract these insights, there are really only two ways to do that. The first is running a search over it, which, certainly powers the world, but is not nearly as sexy as the analytics around, AI and machine learning, which are in that category. So if you're going to pull insights out of data, you're going to either run a search or an analytic over it, and that includes AI or machine learning. So when you start looking at these data assets being across all these different boundaries and silos, whether they're classification boundaries, need to know, third-party data resources, et cetera, then you try to put AI on top of that. That takes it to a whole new level. Why? Because the unit of work in AI is called a machine learning model, and models are only as good as the data that you run them over, that you train them over. So it's extremely, extremely data hungry. So when you start talking about, parking tickets and speeding tickets, of course, everyone wants to kind of reorient and figure out how do we leverage this tool called AI to the highest possible value for the organization. And from a federal perspective, that's really mission value and impacting the mission bottom line. But at the same time, how do we we leverage this data-hungry tool called AI in a way that manages the risks associated with that. And the risks are really underpinned by the data that you're running or training that model over. So a really interesting thing around the family of technologies is PETS family, which Gartner certainly talks about in their market guide for AI trust, risk, and security, is that privacy-enhancing technologies enable model-centric security very uniquely when you start looking at AI. And remember, models being that unit of work, they contain essentially the data that they've been trained over. So when you start looking at running these models across all the boundaries and silos, if you've trained your model over very sensitive data that does not need to leave your walls, if you try to send that model out and run it, so evaluation, inference across a boundary or silo, so in the federal government, into a lower classification domain, for example, it's essentially the same thing as taking that higher classification training data and moving it down to the lower classification, which is a huge, huge problem. You'll definitely get a speeding ticket for that, right? So privacy enhancing technologies come in and take that model that's been trained over sensitive data or been trained over classified data of a higher classification. It can encrypt that model within the higher classified environment and then go run it down in that lower classification environment, or even out into a third party kind of commercially available data holding, or at the edge, all the way out at the edge, without ever decrypting it at any point during processing. So if you never decrypt the model, you never have an opportunity to see the model or pull out any of that really sensitive data over which the model has been trained, nor can you perform these kind of more intelligent adversarial machine learning attack vectors like model spoofing and data poisoning and things like that, right? So now the security enables the mission to get value out of these AI and ML workloads that they could have never done before. So you can get the value without getting that speeding ticket, as you mentioned, which of course, now you can maybe see why AI takes us up to a whole new level.
I did the silly open with Exabyte. I like words. And a few years ago, I learned this word data lake. And then I was interviewing someone last week, and they said, "Not a data lake, it's an ocean." But you kind of took that whole argument and broke it and said, "No, let's rethink this. It's not about the ocean or the data. It's about the model." It's like, okay, we're going to take 500 gallons from that data lake. It could be important 500 gallons, and just manage that. And if you control that, you can have access to it. It's a transition in handling this data than I've seen before.
Correct. And a lot of times what we see in the federal ecosystem and the way that people try to deal with these silos of data and work around them and get value out of them is somewhat different than what we see in the commercial space. So in the federal world, what we see is a lot of data replication and duplication. So if I need to, for example, perform a search, ask a question of a data source, and that question contains highly sensitive types of indicators, then the kind of status quo is I'm going to take that data, and if I can, I'm going to pull it all the way up into my environment. I'm going to duplicate it and I'm going to replicate it in order to be able to ask that sensitive question and perform that search. So that's tremendously expensive because you're incurring all of that cloud storage, compute. You've got a tail associated with that of having to maintain your data, especially at higher classifications, not to mention the people involved with managing all of those data flows from lower classification environments to higher classification environments, things like that. So it's enormously expensive to do what we call lifting and shifting data from lower classification environments up to higher classification environments. So through PETs or privacy enhancing technologies, you can leave it where it is. So leave the data where it is and use it securely in place to extract the insights that you need. Pull only those back up to your higher trust environments, and you could get a speed to insight and decision that's not possible in any other way. And you can have substantial cost savings from not having to pull all of that data and replicate it in all of these kind of domains and environments.
Okay, let's assume Ellison walks in and snaps her fingers and uses her magic and she can increase operational efficiency. Let's assume that. So what kind of agencies would benefit from this? Is just, well, you tell me what kind of agencies would benefit from these advantages.
All agencies, any agency that needs to get the fastest possible insights from data sources across all these boundaries and silos, right? Those boundaries and silos can be classification boundaries or out to third-party data providers, or even look at state local from a federal perspective. How do we all work together and actually get a secure collaborative picture of what's going on, maybe at the border, for example, and do so in such a way that protects the equities involved? So I really think this is across the entire public sector and across the entire federal government. But remember, the technology and the innovation is there to securely use data, search it, watch list over it, run or train machine learning models over it in place across these boundaries or silos. But absent this technology being adopted, what you see is the status quo of lifting and shifting the data up into all of these higher systems, all of these kind of replication across classified environments, or you see people accepting risk that they no longer have to accept. So this is really paradigm shifting, status quo disrupting, which is the definition of disruptive technology.
When you said lift and shift, I think of making the transition to the cloud and then maybe repatriating, moving back and forth. But I always, when I take notes on that, I put SHI with a dollar sign, SHI. So there's expenses involved here. And so what's this impact on resources when you deploy something like your privacy enhancing technology?
It's a tremendous cost savings. There is what we like to do with people is work with them to understand kind of total cost of ownership. So how much data are you really pulling up and replicating in all of these different kind of environments today, just to use it in a way that respects your sensitive interest and intent? And then what if we flip that paradigm completely on its head? What if you can leave the data at the point of origin, which is in the third party, or all the way out at the tactical edge, or in the lower classification environment where it's being originated, and use it there? How much can you really save? And so as we've walked through this with people for the last few years, we found some really interesting things in that we would present these kind of total cost of ownerships with the specific mission entities, and we would show, hey, we can save you millions and millions of dollars a year. And some of the response we got back was like, well, we're not interested in saving money. And I'm not, and you laugh, but I'm not making that up, which makes me very sad, right? As a taxpayer, and looking at that mission entity as stewarding taxpayer dollars to the highest return from a national security and defense perspective. I think the exciting thing around this administration, whether or not people agree with the politics, is this drive towards stewarding the taxpayer dollar to the highest possible return for national security and defense purposes. And part of that is, let's not spend money we don't have to spend on duplicative storage, movement, cost around data. Let's actually save that money, because technology can now enable us to do that, get the fastest possible decisions that we can, insights that we can, et cetera. And then let's either save that money and repurpose it elsewhere, or just save it from a U.S. government perspective. So I think when we start looking at stewardship, I think it's a very exciting time of what we're seeing in terms of those outcomes that we're driving toward, regardless, like I said, of politics or the way those are being achieved, whether people agree with it or don't agree with it. I think that idea of creating operational efficiencies through innovative commercial capability around data is absolutely exciting.
Well, Ellison, you know this guy, Simon Sinek, he says start with why, but I'm going to start with who. So who should lead the change in the federal government here? Agencies, entities, who's going to be the instigator here?
I think we all have to work together in order to make that happen. So I think it's the mission entities, the people that are executing the mission, the people that are owning the systems, the people have responsibility for those data assets, of getting them in the right places, of leveraging all of the best ones that we possibly can, and then working with the innovators. So there's so many really innovative kind of commercial companies, and that's also an exciting part that we see kind of happening right now, is this kind of orientation around, hey, if we can adopt it from a COTS perspective, go for it. Let's do it. And then we'll build only what we have to build here around that, right? So I think it's really a collective effort. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think there's a single savior. We've got to work together to achieve the end outcome.
So this policy change, is this more technical, or is this policy? Well, in this town, everything's policy. But so where does it, skew towards?
I think it's a little bit of both, which is, kind of like my answer to the question that you just asked me, in that you're not really going to develop policy around innovation that doesn't exist yet. So innovation from a technology perspective always is going to outpace policy, and it's also going to outpace standards. Why? Because why develop policy around something that you can't actually do, that the technology isn't there to actually affect it? So we see innovation driving policy. I mean, a great example of that is look at what's going on with AI right now. So AI and machine learning has been around quite a while. Gen AI certainly took that to a whole new level, and people want to adopt it because of its transformative potential. Now the policy is having to catch up with it. And that's a very dramatic example, right? Those technology waves of that kind of magnitude and that kind of crash on the shore, the tsunami kind of effect of that happen kind of once in a while, right? But it's a very clear example of technology is going to lead, policy is going to follow. And that's also what we see with, privacy enhancing technologies and enabling this kind of operational efficiency. Well, if I can use data where it is and as it is through this kind of technology, then what policies do I need to put in place in order to make that happen, to kind of disrupt that status quo of lifting and shifting and duplicating and replicating information and all these different kinds of environments across all these silos and boundaries just to use it in a secure way. And maybe I don't need to be accepting all of the risk. I don't have to accept as much risk as I did before the technology enabled me to mitigate that risk, for example, out at the tactical edge.
So when you assemble an LLM, you have to bring in information from other sources. And the terms is data at rest and data in transit. And you may have to encrypt data at rest, of course, and encrypt data. Now, what you're suggesting is, well, just use it at rest and structure it so it can be used efficiently and not have to go to the expense that everything else has to create these large language models.
Yeah, so there are three states of data. Data can be at rest, right, in the file system, in the database, et cetera. It can be moving around through the network, so that's data in transit. And then finally, data in use. So data in use is when you're running that search analytic over it, your machine learning, AI kinds of workflows to get those insights out that yield value for the organization. So in the absence of a way to secure the usage of data, well, you should absolutely be securing your data at rest and in transit, but you're also going to be moving it around all over the place in order to try to approximate a secure usage of data. And approximate it meaning I'm going to pull it all into my silo that I consider to be trusted, and I'm going to use it there in the clear, because that's the only way that I have to secure it, is build up a big wall around it. But the technology now exists to secure data in use in place. So no longer are you building big fences around the data, you're pulling it into all these silos, but you can use it securely where it is and as it is, protected at rest and in transit, so you can complete that third kind of leg of that data triad. And that will completely change kind of how you treat data, where you can pull assets from data, and the speed at which you can do it in a secure and private way.
Yeah, this privacy enhancement technology, it's almost like looking at data sets in a different way, a different approach. This must be your challenge, to explain this to people and say, no, really, it really can work this way. But if you look at one of my favorite books is The History of Science, you talk about there's always certain levels where people have something new and then there's a breakthrough. But a lot of times, 2 or 3 people come at the same time with the same idea, but there's this breakthrough, and people realize, well, maybe I don't have to do all this expensive data in transit and I can keep. So that's your challenge, just letting people become aware of what this technology can do.
Oh, 100%. It's the Henry Ford principle, right? So, classically and famously, when he was developing the automobile, and the problem of transportation, of moving from point A to point B, had existed. They just solved it in a different way, right? So if he asked people at the time, well, how would you, if you could kind of wave your magic wand, what would you want to be able to move from point A to B faster? And they would say, well, I want a better horse. He said, but I've got something called this automobile, and has technology that you've never heard of, and you've never even been in one, and it lets you go way faster than a horse ever could. People are like, nah, I want a better horse. And the whole transportation industry is geared around horses, right? Wagons and people moving things and whatever else. It's exactly the same thing here. So when you look at, okay, well, people have to use data, and they've got to use it in a way that respects their interest and intent. So how did they kind of solve that problem before, absent the ability to securely use it in place, where they're going to replicate it and they're going to move it, or they're going to accept risk? Neither one of those are efficient.
Now, an argument can be made that things are happening in downtown Washington, D.C. that are forcing people to get out their microscopes or their binoculars or whatever and look at this whole idea of assembling LLMs more efficiently than before. And so this should be playing right into your hand. I mean, this is exactly what you've been talking about for years, operational efficiency. And maybe those people aren't going to say anymore that we don't care how much. Now, all of a sudden, hey, Ellison, now we care.
Correct. And there are some people that are really on the forefront of this. So, for example, we are working with Project Linchpin inside of Army that are building this secure ML operations backbone there. And they absolutely recognize the challenge of needing to leverage these sensitive machine learning models in ways and places that, of course, are very untrusted, that are not protected, and needing to make sure that those sensitive machine learning models stay secure, stay protected as they're being used in those untrusted kind of edge environments and across all these domains. So it's exciting to be on the forefront of that. It's exciting to work with people who understand the need to mitigate that risk, to really leverage all the data assets we possibly can to achieve our mission inside of the DoD.
And here's just one thing I'm sure you thought of, and they thought of also, is that many times artificial intelligence is creating more data. And so you're almost at the end, and all of a sudden it's every time you think you're at the end. And so you have to have something structurally that can handle all this drastic increase. And we can talk about any bytes you want, but what's happening now is that, there's metadata being created by engines on a daily basis. There's got to be a different way to manage it.
Correct. Because the data volumes are rising so much, that kind of status quo of, what traditionally is data replication and duplication, lift and shift in the federal ecosystem is rapidly becoming non-tenable, not possible. So we're getting to a place where you could no longer think that you can replicate the entire internet into high-side systems just to ask some questions that you don't want anybody to know that you're asking. So that day is coming, and we should just get ahead of it because the technology exists. It's here ready now, as we like to say, and it can really change that whole paradigm and really enable that kind of operational efficiency that was otherwise never possible before.
Operational efficiency. So it sounds like you're optimistic for the next 5 to 7 years.
Absolutely. Very optimistic. We think that the technology is ready, clearly. We see kind of policy standardization coming along very soon after that. And then I think geopolitically what's happening is very interesting from a privacy enhancing technology family in that you've got all of this data, as we talked about before, but at the same time, as you have this drive to use all available data resources, this kind of globalization, you also have this pulling in or hyper localization. So more data silos, more data values being trapped. And then you become, kind of paralyzed with, well, I've got all this unrealized value. How do I use this data in a way that's meaningful to me as a business? And then, of course, AI takes that up to a whole new level, as we talked about. And that's a huge problem. But an exciting one for the pets family, privacy enhancing technology family, because the technologies are ready and they can help solve that problem.
Yeah, and everything from third-party holdings to sensors and IoT and OT. I mean, this is like, we didn't even know we had all these sensors and all this data is coming in, and how do you securely handle that? It's a difficult problem, and I think you've given our listeners a little bit better idea of how to enhance their privacy in a safe manner, and it turns out efficiently, economically as well. Mm-hmm. We're running out of time here, Ellison, unfortunately. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Ellison Anne Williams, CEO and founder of Enveil, ENVEIL. Thank you, Ellison.